70 years ago, a 4-year-old girl vanished from the backyard of a small house in Newburyport, Massachusetts, leaving behind no trace except a red tricycle lying abandoned in the snow. Police suspected a female neighbor might be involved, but with no body, no clear evidence, the case quickly went cold. Yet for decades, one younger sister never gave up hope, convinced her big sister was still alive somewhere, waiting to be found. Then one day, while reopening the old files, she uncovered a tiny detail that had been overlooked for 60 years, a detail powerful enough to turn the entire case upside down and shock everyone who thought the truth was buried forever. Before we dive into this shocking story, let me know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit subscribe so you don't miss the next cases. Massachusetts, winter of 1955. The quiet riverside town of Newburyport lay under a thick blanket of snow, skeletal maple trees standing motionless in the biting wind. It was an era when people still left their doors unlocked, trusting the safety of their community and the familiarity of neighbors. In a small residential area near the Merrimack River, the Hughes family lived in a pale yellow 2-story wooden house. William, a mechanical engineer at the General Electric plant, Margaret, a gentle stay-at-home wife who spent most of her time in the kitchen, and Hannah, their lively 4-year-old blonde daughter, who was always riding her old tricycle around the backyard. Their life was steady and simple, undisturbed except for the cold gusts that whipped through each morning. Across the fence lived Evelyn Carter, a widow in her 40s who lived alone with her gray cat. Evelyn had once been an elementary school teacher. After her husband died, she moved to Newburyport and was regarded by neighbors as kind, quiet, and helpful. Margaret occasionally asked her to watch Hannah while she ran errands, and in return received jars of strawberry jam or freshly baked pies. The two women shared a polite, neighborly friendliness, though Margaret sometimes felt uneasy about something in Evelyn's gaze, an intense, almost excessive attention toward her daughter that she couldn't quite name. On the morning of February 9th, William left early for his shift, leaving mother and daughter in the white expanse. Margaret was doing laundry on the porch, while Hannah, in her red coat, rode her tricycle in the backyard. From the kitchen window, Margaret could still see her daughter moving through the snow. Just before 10 a.m., Evelyn Carter knocked on the door carrying a freshly baked apple pie and offered to watch Hannah if Margaret needed to go out. The conversation was brief. Then Evelyn returned to her house across the fence. Margaret went back to her wet laundry and turned on the radio for the weather report. Temperatures dropping sharply, winds from the north. In the minutes that followed, she no longer heard the sound of tricycle wheels on snow. When she looked outside again, the backyard was empty. The red tricycle lay tipped on its side, small footprints scattered then disappearing near the gate. Margaret called Hannah's name, first calmly, then in rising panic. She ran around the house, into the neighbor's yard, knocking on every nearby door. No one had seen the little girl. A man shoveling snow at the end of the street said he had seen a little girl in a red coat, walking with a woman wearing a fur hat, about 10 minutes earlier. Margaret immediately ran in that direction, but found only a snow-covered road and faint tire tracks already being filled in by fresh flakes. When William was called home, he burst through the door to find his wife standing in the yard, still clutching their daughter's tiny mitten. They searched the neighborhood until dusk fell. They walked along the riverbank, calling Hannah's name into the wind, hearing nothing in reply but the cold water lapping against the ice. As daylight faded from the rooftops, William went back inside, picked up the phone, and called the Newburyport police station to report his daughter missing. On the other end of the line, the duty officer quickly took down the details, told him to stay calm, asked for a description of the child, and confirmed the address. The call was logged at 4:27 p.m. The information was immediately passed to Sergeant Thomas O'Leary, head of the department's rapid response team and a 15-year veteran of local investigations. 2 patrol cars left the station within 10 minutes, sirens wailing and red lights flashing off the thick snow covering the roads to Merrimack Street. By the time they arrived, twilight had fallen, the wind was howling, and neighbors were still gathered outside the gate, some holding flashlights, others walking the area, calling the little girl's name. William Hughes stood in the middle of the yard, face pale, coat still unzipped. Margaret sat on the front steps, clutching the small wool mitten later confirmed to belong to their daughter. O'Leary stepped out of his car, ordered the area cordoned off with tape, told all residents to leave the yard, and began compiling a list of everyone who had been on scene that afternoon. He had 2 officers sketch a temporary site map and measured distances between footprints and other marks. Under the dim glow of headlights, the thick snow clearly showed the tracks of the tipped-over tricycle near the fence. Beside it was a trail of small child's footprints interwoven with adult shoe prints leading toward the gate, where the snow was heavily disturbed. At the edge of the yard, unusual tire tread marks indicated a vehicle had stopped briefly before turning back toward the main road. O'Leary measured and marked each trace with small wooden stakes. One officer photographed the scene with a Polaroid camera, while another collected evidence: the mitten, a scrap of red fabric stuck in the snow, a piece of the tricycle frame. Everything was sealed in bags, labeled with time, date, and the officer's name. When the outdoor work was done, O'Leary entered the house. The small kitchen was lit by a weak yellow bulb. The air smelled of cold coffee and lingering chill. Margaret sat silently in a chair wrapped in a blanket, eyes vacant. He began taking her statement. The last moment she saw her daughter, what the child was wearing, who had visited that day. Her answers came in fragments, repeated over and over, just a few minutes. William sat beside her, trying to recount the moment he was notified, and insisting there had been no strangers in the area. When O'Leary asked about Evelyn Carter, they pointed toward the house across the fence. An officer was sent to knock. Evelyn appeared in a heavy coat and hooded hat, face unreadable. She confirmed she had visited the Hughes home that morning with an apple pie and said she had stayed home all afternoon, only hearing Margaret's panicked cries later. Her statement was recorded in full, timed, witnessed, and included a detailed description of the relationship between the 2 families. After the interviews, the team searched the wider area: fences, under cars, sheds, adjacent lots, and the path down to the river. No foreign objects or signs of forced entry were found. Falling snow was already erasing traces. O'Leary ordered all movement stopped within a 20-meter radius of the yard to preserve the scene. He compiled a preliminary report listing the victim, time, evidence, weather conditions, witnesses, and unknown circumstances. His initial assessment read, "No signs of forced abduction. Possible victim was lured or willingly led away." The report and photos were faxed to Essex County headquarters, requesting forensic support and coordination with the medical examiner. When the work was finished, the police left the Hughes home, posting 1 officer for overnight perimeter watch. O'Leary lingered longer, staring at the backyard through the reflective tape as snow continued to fall, covering the tipped tricycle and the small mitten still bearing traces of mud. Before leaving, he wrote one final note in his notebook. Second set of footprints, women's size 27, leading to gate. Gender not yet confirmed. The next morning, after the snow stopped, Merrimack Street remained sealed off, police cars blocking both ends. Sergeant O'Leary returned early with a map of the area and ordered the search expanded to a 2-mile radius from the Hughes home. The operation involved local police, firefighters, state reserve troops, and dozens of community volunteers. They were divided into small teams equipped with tracking dogs, floodlights, probes, and radios. A temporary command post was set up in a nearby church where officers updated progress by sector. The map spread across a wooden table showed dense forest to the north, the river and marina to the south, Route 1A to the east, and the old paper mill industrial zone to the west. O'Leary assigned 3 teams to the woods and 2 along the riverbank, instructing them to look for anything unusual: clothing, footprints, children's items, or suspicious vehicles. From 8 a.m. to noon, Teams reported continuously by radio, but found nothing significant beyond old truck tracks already covered by snow and scattered wind-blown trash. Early in the afternoon, a volunteer near the western wooded area radioed that a man shoveling snow claimed to have seen an unfamiliar woman leading a little girl in a red coat heading toward the main road about 400 meters from the Hughes house on the morning of the disappearance. He described the woman as average height, wearing a dark coat and wide fur hat, white gloves, age unclear. The child walked obediently beside her, holding what looked like a small doll. The information was logged immediately. O'Leary sent 2 officers to interview the witness, cross-check timing, direction and position relative to the scene. The statement was deemed credible because it matched the time Margaret reported her daughter missing. From the description, a rough composite sketch was hand-drawn by a department artist, light-skinned woman, around 40, wearing a fur hat. No distinctive features. O'Leary issued an internal alert, distributed the sketch to all patrol stations across Essex and the Merrimack Valley, and ordered checks of bus depots, train stations and gas stations within 20 miles. That afternoon, firefighters in inflatable boats dragged the shallow river areas with hooks, but found only broken branches and driftwood. By evening, the search radius was extended another mile east, but worsening weather and plunging temperatures forced outdoor operations to halt at 9 p.m. O'Leary filed the day's report, summarizing areas covered, personnel numbers, evidence, and new statements. In his notes, he wrote, "No new physical traces. Only one additional witness, snow shoveler. No suspicious vehicles identified." Before leaving command, he studied the map one last time, looking at the pencil circles and the many areas already crossed off. The entire 48-hour search ended without results. A 4-year-old girl had vanished from a small town, leaving nothing behind but a tricycle, a wool mitten, and footprints already erased by fresh snow. On the afternoon of the 3rd day after the disappearance, the first news story hit the front page of the Newburyport Daily News with the bold headline, "4-year-old girl vanishes in winter snow." The article was short and based on police information, but by that evening, the story had spread across Essex County. Local radio stations repeatedly mentioned the case, speculating about a stranger who abducted the child. Outside the Hughes home, reporters and curious onlookers grew in number, camera flashes cutting through the falling snow. Margaret, exhausted from sleepless nights, tried to stay inside but was still photographed through the window. Within days, public opinion shifted, blaming the mother for letting her daughter play alone in harsh weather. One Boston newspaper even asked, "Was this the negligence of a young mother?" Under media pressure, Sergeant O'Leary held a press conference at headquarters. He confirmed the investigation was ongoing, urged the public to come forward with information, and announced they were expanding the search for the stranger suspect based on the only description of a woman in a fur hat. After the conference, hundreds of calls flooded the tip line, most false leads or mismatched sightings. Some claimed to have seen a dark-colored car parked nearby that morning. Others said a strange woman asked for directions to the docks. Every tip was logged, investigated, and eventually dismissed. Internally, O'Leary decided to re-interview the entire family. William Hughes was brought in for nearly 2 hours of questioning. He provided his work schedule at the factory, confirmed by witnesses who saw him there all morning. His alibi was solid. The report stated, "No direct connection to the father." Police then checked everyone who regularly passed through the Merrimack area: delivery drivers, mailmen, milkmen, snow-clearing crews. 6 individuals were questioned, 4 had alibis, and the remaining 2 were passing travelers who didn't match the witness description. The investigation stalled, but media pressure continued, forcing O'Leary to issue daily updates. Meanwhile, Margaret barely left the house, her health deteriorating. The local doctor visited to prescribe sedatives. William took leave from work to assist police, but grew increasingly worn down by press scrutiny. By the end of the week, O'Leary returned to the surrounding houses. When asked about Evelyn Carter, neighbors said she had left town 2 days earlier, saying she was visiting relatives in Vermont. No one noticed exactly when or how she left. Her file note read, "Witness Carter, absent, unverified." With no warrant, police did not pursue her further. Resources were redirected to checking major roads and stopping trucks that passed through on the day of the incident. But nothing suspicious was found. The Essex County Crime Lab's preliminary report showed the evidence collected contained no identifiable biological traces, only red wool fibers and a tire tread that matched no local vehicles. Temporary conclusion: no additional physical evidence, no signs of violence, victim's direction of travel unknown. O'Leary submitted his report to state police, acknowledging the case lacked investigative leads and could remain open indefinitely. Outside, snow began falling again, covering the Hughes backyard, where every initial trace of the disappearance had now completely vanished. After 3 weeks with no new leads, Newburyport police formally requested FBI assistance. The Hannah Hughes missing person file was sent to the Boston field office, classified as child abduction, no ransom. On March 4th, 2 agents from the FBI's Violent Crimes Against Children unit arrived to work with Sergeant O'Leary. They reviewed all files, evidence, statements, and photos, then re-interviewed key witnesses. Their initial assessment found no ransom demand, no financial motive, and no evidence of physical violence. The FBI report stated, no elements of extortion or physical assault, high probability of non-ransom abduction. The agents re-examined the now snow-covered scene, took additional soil and fabric samples near the fence, and sent them to the federal lab. They also built a 3D model of the neighborhood from topographic maps to compare trace locations with possible suspect routes. However, prolonged cold and initial scene disruption rendered most new samples forensically useless. Fingerprint and DNA tests came back negative. At a meeting in Essex County headquarters, the lead agent declared the chance of recovering new physical evidence was virtually zero. He recommended narrowing the focus to the family's social circle and considering an acquaintance abduction. O'Leary mildly objected, citing no clear motive from relatives or neighbors, but agreed to expanded interviews within a 5-mile radius. Over the next 2 weeks, more than 30 people were questioned. Evelyn Carter's former teaching colleagues, Williams' factory co-workers, and nearby families. No useful information emerged. The investigation was classified, no specific suspect. The 12-page FBI summary sent to Washington concluded the case lacked interstate elements, no proof the victim had been taken across state lines, and therefore did not fall under direct federal jurisdiction. After final review, the agents left Newburyport, recommending continued local investigation and contact if new evidence surfaced. The file was returned to Essex County Police with the note, "No ransom, no interstate evidence, local jurisdiction maintained." Sergeant O'Leary read the summary at the end of March, folded it, and locked it in the safe. At that point, the official police search was suspended. The Hughes family refused to give up. Williams spent their remaining savings printing flyers and posting them at bus stations, train depots, post offices, diners, and gas stations throughout the region. Every week he drove the Boston-Vermont route, stopping in every town to ask questions, carrying a small stack of Hannah's photo. Margaret stayed in Newburyport, her health fragile, speaking only to a few relatives. The house on Merrimack Street grew cold and silent. The police tape was removed. The backyard buried under fresh winter snow. No more officers, no more reporters, just fading tire tracks and the old white fence. The final boundary between where a little girl once played and the silent void no one knew where it led. When spring arrived, the ice gradually melted from the rooftops on Merrimack Street, but nothing changed in the small house of the Hughes family. After nearly 3 months of fruitless searching, there were no longer police officers standing guard, no patrol cars or searchlights sweeping through the windows, only silence remained. Margaret barely left the bedroom, refused to eat, spoke incoherently, and frequently woke up in the middle of the night, hallucinating that she heard her child calling from the yard. The local doctor concluded she was suffering from acute depression and required long-term treatment. In early May, On the doctor's recommendation, William agreed to have his wife admitted to the St. Luke's Psychiatric Nursing Facility in Salem, nearly 40 miles from Newburyport. He signed the admission form with a trembling hand, writing only a brief reason: mental trauma following the loss of child. After that day, the house that had always echoed with a child's laughter suddenly became empty. William spent most of his remaining time printing flyers and mailing letters to other police departments across the state, but received no response. At the end of the summer, the factory where he worked laid off staff, and he applied for a transfer to Boston. On the day he left, William locked the door, sealed the house, handed the keys to the neighborhood manager, and said he would return when there's news. From then on, the house on Merrimack Street stood abandoned, its windows shuttered, grass growing tall around the fence. Neighbors gradually stopped talking about the case, and those who had joined the search moved away. Evelyn Carter, the only witness who had lived next door to the Hughes family, still had not returned to town. Her temporary address in Vermont remained unverified. O'Leary, after receiving the final report from the FBI, officially ended the active search phase and locked the case file in the Essex County Sheriff's Department safe. A brief internal meeting on June 18 concluded: no new evidence, no suspects, no additional physical evidence. All personnel were reassigned to regular duties. In the meeting minutes, O'Leary added a note: investigation area no longer active. The public has provided no further information. The order to terminate the search was sent to the state office, officially suspending the Hannah Hughes investigation. When the temporary signs were taken down, the neighborhood returned to normal life. Children in the area still played in their front yards, but the adults no longer mentioned Hannah's name. On some afternoons, people occasionally saw William return alone, parking on the side of the road, standing and staring at the old house for a few minutes before driving away without going inside. Every year, when the snow began to fall, the front door of the house would be pushed open by the wind, revealing the thick layer of dust covering the furniture inside, where the last traces of a family that once existed still lay silently in the empty room. In early 1956, nearly a year after Hannah disappeared, the Essex County Sheriff's Office officially classified the case as inactive. An internal notice was issued, marking the file closure date as January 12. The simple typed line in the temporary conclusion read, "Missing minor. No foul play established." The entire file was bound into 3 volumes, one containing scene reports, one compiling witness statements, and the final one holding photographs and forensic reports. The 3 volumes were sealed, numbered 55-014, and transferred to the county archives in Salem. Before handover, Sergeant Thomas O'Leary signed the final confirmation, noting, "No further basis for investigation. All traces destroyed by weather conditions." That same day, he sent a short copy of the report to the Massachusetts State Prosecutor's Office. They replied with a one-line memo: "No criminal elements identified." After months with no new information, O'Leary requested removal from the task force and returned to administrative duties. In March of that year, he applied for early retirement, citing health reasons. Before leaving his office, he made a personal copy of the Hannah Hughes file, carefully wrapped it in a hard folder, wrote the name in black ink, and took it home. No one in the department noticed. It was common for retiring officers to keep copies of unsolved cases. In the final summary, the chief investigator wrote, "The Hannah Hughes disappearance shows no evidence of crime, no suspects. Recommend indefinite archival." By then, the Hughes family home had been sold to a young couple. The backyard was renovated, the fence repainted white. No one in the neighborhood mentioned the child anymore. Only O'Leary occasionally drove back to Newburyport, passing Merrimack Street, stopping for a few minutes in front of the old house. He never got out of the car, just sat there flipping through his old notebook and rereading his own notes. Second set of footprints, size 27, heading toward the gate. Deep down, he knew the case was dead on paper, yet he wrote one final line in his private journal: "No evidence, no resolution." Only questions remain. When he left the department, he turned in his badge and all equipment, but kept one Polaroid photograph of the Hughes backyard. The snowy scene with the tipped-over tricycle. He placed the photo in a drawer at his home in Danvers. Every year when the snow fell, he would take it out, look at it, then carefully put it away again, like a silent ritual of a man who once believed justice could be found in dusty files. By the end of that year, the Essex County Archive completed its reorganization. The Hannah Hughes case was placed in the second slot of shelf C7 between two other minor missing persons cases from the same year. A red seal stamped closed was pressed onto the edge of the folder, marking the official end of an investigation that had never found a single clue. In the State Police Annual Summary, the case appeared in only one line under Unsolved Cases. Female child, age 4, missing, no evidence of foul play. After that, no one in the system ever mentioned the name again. After the Hannah Hughes disappearance file was archived, time passed quietly. Newburyport returned to ordinary life. Winter followed winter, and the case gradually became a story whispered in rare gatherings of old residents. Still, every now and then small rumors would surface and die out. In the fall of 1958, the town police received an anonymous letter from someone claiming to live in Burlington, Vermont. The writer said they had seen a little girl whose face was very similar to the photo published in 1955, living with a middle-aged woman in a wooden house near Lake Champlain. The child was called by a different name, but the smile and blonde hair were unmistakable. The letter was forwarded to the Essex County Sheriff's Office and landed in administration. The new sergeant appointed after O'Leary, John McCauley, read it carefully and compared it to the old file. He sent 2 officers to Burlington to verify, coordinating with local police. The report came back after 3 days. No child matching the description. The family mentioned in the letter does not exist at the stated address. The check ended there. No further legal action was taken. In 1961, another tip from Boston included a photograph of a girl attending a local elementary school, also said to resemble Hannah. The records team reopened the old photo file, compared them visually. Facial recognition technology did not yet exist, and concluded insufficient basis. The internal memo simply noted, similar appearance, not confirmed. Nevertheless, the rumor spread quickly. Local papers ran a short column recalling the long-forgotten disappearance. The article unsettled some of the original investigators. A few Newburyport residents called to ask questions, even claiming they had seen the child at summer fairs in northern parts of the state, but no one provided concrete evidence. By the mid-1960s, the Essex County Records Office conducted its periodic administrative review. Old cases were evaluated for possible reopening. Hannah Hughes was listed under missing children. No suspects, no evidence. The review minutes stated clearly, no basis for reopening due to lack of new evidence, legal grounds, or additional witnesses. File 55-014 was closed again, with a new note clipped to it. Review 1965, no action. It was then moved from shelf C7 to long-term storage in the basement of the administration building. The Polaroid scene photos had faded. The edges of the cardboard folders frayed. When Massachusetts began reorganizing its criminal record system, the Hannah Hughes case was entered into the cold case, Essex County category, coded 55-014C, meaning it was officially inactive, and could only be reopened with new evidence or an order from the state prosecutor. Outside the archive, life in Newburyport had changed. The Hughes house was sold again, and nearly everyone who had known the family had moved away. In the local paper, the name Hannah Hughes appeared one last time on the 10th anniversary of the disappearance, in a small inside-page article titled simply An Old Unsolved Case. No more anonymous letters arrived, no more witnesses came forward. The case sank into oblivion, lying silent among hundreds of other files that shared the same conclusion, missing, no evidence of foul play, unresolved. Time continued to pass. Those who had once been haunted by the case died one by one, and the name of the child from long ago became only a faint memory in the Essex County archives. Outside, America entered a new decade. Old neighborhoods changed. New houses went up, and no one suspected that hundreds of miles away, the story was still continuing under a different name. Back in the late 1950s, in a quiet suburb of Montpelier, Vermont, a middle-aged woman moved into a small wooden house beside a dirt road leading to Lake Champlain. She introduced herself as Evelyn Lane and brought with her a girl about 5 years old, blonde, thin, with pale blue eyes. To the neighbors, she said the child was her biological daughter, named Margaret Lane, born in Worcester, Massachusetts, and that the father had died in a car accident a few years earlier. No one doubted it. Vermont was still a peaceful, sparsely populated place where people accepted simple stories. Evelyn presented Margaret's birth certificate at City Hall to register residency. The document was carefully typed, stamped with an official state seal, the father's name left blank, and the certifying physician listed as Dr. J. Randall, Vermont General Hospital. No one recognized it as a forgery. It was skillfully made, complete with seals and signatures. With that certificate, Evelyn legalized the child's new identity, opened a small bank account, obtained ration cards, and registered residence in Washington County. She rented the 2-bedroom wooden house, planted flowers around the porch, and put up a white fence. The little girl, now called Margaret, played quietly in the yard and rarely left the property. Every morning Evelyn woke her at 7, cooked breakfast, then taught her reading and writing, using old textbooks bought from a second-hand shop. When neighbors asked why she didn't send the child to school, Evelyn said the public school was too far, the winter roads dangerous, and she preferred to teach at home for safety. Homeschooling was not yet strictly regulated in Vermont, so no one questioned it. The neighborhood saw it as normal for a cautious widow. Evelyn kept to herself, only greeting people at the market, always wearing gloves even when it wasn't cold, and never spoke of her past. The child grew up in a closed world with strict rules. Do not leave the yard without permission. Do not talk to strangers. Do not answer letters. Evelyn taught her to call her mommy, and stressed that it was just the two of them in the world, no one else. Inside the house, everything was orderly. The child's closet held exactly 3 dresses, 1 pair of shoes, and a red coat with mended sleeves. On the wall hung a single black and white photograph of mother and daughter in front of the house, taken by a traveling photographer who was paid in cash. The photo had no date. Neighbors occasionally saw Evelyn take Margaret to the market. The girl walked obediently beside her, rarely spoke, and always held her mother's hand tightly. People in the area called them the Lane mother and daughter, and considered them a familiar part of the community. When anyone asked about relatives elsewhere, Evelyn simply smiled and said her old life had ended in Massachusetts, and she only wanted peace now. A few people once curiously asked about Margaret's father, but received a curt reply, "He's dead. I don't want to talk about it," and that ended the conversation. In the 1960s, as Montpelier expanded, roads and population grew, the Lane house remained almost isolated. Evelyn took a part-time job at the town library, while Margaret stayed home reading and keeping a diary as her mother required. None of the neighbors ever saw the girl disobey or leave the house alone. Once a public health worker came to check vaccination records, Evelyn claimed the child was allergic to the shots, signed an exemption, and showed the worker out. The medical report was accepted. Through these procedures, the identity Margaret Lane became fully legal in Vermont state records. To everyone, they were simply a quiet little family that kept to themselves and caused no trouble. No one noticed that every letter arriving from Massachusetts was immediately torn up and burned in the fireplace, or that the woman named Evelyn locked the windows and drew the curtains every night, as if afraid some shadow was still watching them from the edge of the forest. As time passed, the small Lane house became increasingly closed off. After settling into life in Montpelier, Evelyn began cutting almost all social contact. She quit the library job, citing health reasons, and almost never appeared at town events. The mailman said that whenever he delivered something, he had to knock for a long time before a hoarse voice answered from behind the locked door. "Just leave it there, thank you." No one was ever allowed inside. The curtains stayed drawn even during the day, The front gate was secured with an iron bar, and Evelyn planted thick bushes around the house like a wall. Neighbors stopped visiting because they felt unwelcome. When someone did ask after them, she gave short, polite answers and closed the door. Margaret, now about 8 years old, was still called my darling girl, but was tightly controlled. Every activity followed a fixed schedule: lessons, meals, sleep, reading, chores. She was not allowed outside the yard, not allowed to speak to strangers, not allowed to answer questions about her real name or birthplace. Evelyn taught her that the outside world was full of danger, that there were people who had once tried to take her away. Whenever Margaret asked about her father, Evelyn told the same story. He had died in a terrible accident on the way to Vermont, and they had to leave Massachusetts to escape painful memories. She stressed that they had no other relatives, that it was just the two of them. Gradually, Margaret fully believed the story. In the hazy memory of a child, images of her old home and neighborhood faded, replaced by memories of pine forests and the winter lake. She memorized everything her mother told her and repeated it reflexively whenever anyone accidentally asked about the past. My dad died. My mom is from Vermont. Evelyn controlled all outside contact: no telephone, no mail, no friends. She cut the girl's hair herself, sewed clothes herself, taught every subject herself. The house became its own world, where any strange noise from outside made Evelyn instantly alert. At night she walked around checking windows, sliding bolts into place, before turning off the lights. Sometimes, Margaret woke up and saw the faint glow of an oil lamp in the kitchen, and her mother's silhouette at the table, writing something in a small notebook, then tearing out the page and burning it in the fireplace. When she asked, Evelyn only said, "Mommy is writing things we shouldn't remember." Every summer when other children gathered on the grass near Lake Champlain, Margaret could only watch from behind the fence. Evelyn always said she was sick, or afraid of the water. Neighbors gradually forgot the girl even existed, assuming she was just shy and fearful of people. The older residents occasionally saw the two of them walking to the market early in the morning, buying a few small things and heading straight home. No one ever heard Margaret speak, except to Evelyn. In the child's mind, the house became the entire world, and everything outside was a strange place her mother always warned her about. Every night before bed, Evelyn read passages from the Bible about punishment, about sin and redemption, then made the child pray that God gave you a new mother to protect you. As Margaret grew older, she began to sense something was wrong, but didn't know what to question. There was no one to ask, nothing to compare against. In every document she was shown, the name Margaret Lane appeared everywhere, on the birth certificate, medical records, vaccination card. Whenever she asked about the past, Evelyn smiled, stroked her head, and said, "Whatever happened before you came to Mommy doesn't matter anymore." Under that roof, every trace of the previous life had been erased. No photos, no letters, no toys from before 1955 remained. Margaret gradually became the person in the story Evelyn had created, a child with no origins, no memories, belonging only to one person. The winter of 1979 was colder than usual in Vermont. Thick snow blanketed the small wooden house where the Lane mother and daughter had lived for more than 2 decades. Evelyn was now in her 60s, her health failing. She rarely left her bed. Margaret, 24 years old, still lived with her, holding only part-time work at the grocery store down the street. On the morning of February 3rd, when she went to wake her mother, she found her lying motionless, hands crossed on her chest, face peaceful as if only asleep. The local doctor confirmed the cause of death as a stroke, likely around midnight. The funeral was simple. A few neighbors came, offered brief condolences, and left. No relatives, no family, no one else to handle arrangements. After the burial, Margaret stayed alone in the silent house. While cleaning out belongings in the days that followed, she discovered things Evelyn had never allowed her to touch. In the bottom drawer of the writing desk, beneath a stack of old books, was a dark tin box with a rusted lock. She pried it open with a small knife. Inside was a bundle of old papers held together with a rubber band, a few black and white photographs, an old train ticket faintly printed with Newburyport Station, 1955, and a birth certificate in the name of Margaret Lane. The paper was yellowed, bearing a red seal that did not match official Vermont birth certificate templates she had seen. The certifying physician was listed as J. Randall, but the handwriting differed from the rest of the document. She stared at the train ticket, a vague feeling stirred, as if old memories were surfacing. Fragmented images flashed by: snow, a white gate, the sound of a metal bell, and someone bending down to tie a scarf for her. One of the photographs showed a younger Evelyn standing beside a small girl in a red coat, the girl's face identical to her own childhood self. But the background was not Montpelier. On the back, written in ink, were the words, "Winter 1955. She sat silently for a long time, staring at the items, trying to understand their connection. For years, Evelyn had never once mentioned Massachusetts or anywhere else. All talk of origins had been forbidden. That night, she didn't sleep, just stared at the papers on the table. The next morning, Margaret took them to the Washington County Clerk's office and asked about the validity of the birth certificate. The clerk checked the records and said no matching entry existed for that number or certifying doctor. They suspected it was a privately printed copy and invalid. She tried to explain it was the certificate her mother had given her, but the supervisor simply repeated that it could not be recognized without an original record. Margaret left feeling empty. That afternoon, she went to the local police station, handed over the certificate and train ticket, and said something was wrong about her identity. The duty officer listened, wrote a few lines in the log, then told her it was an administrative matter, not criminal, and advised her to consult a lawyer. When she asked if the old train ticket could be traced, he only shrugged. 20-year-old ticket, no way to trace it. She took the papers back and walked out into the snow, feeling as if she had stepped into an unreal world. A few days later, she wrote to the Massachusetts Vital Records Office requesting a search for the birth of Margaret Lane, but received a short reply: no record found. Please provide parents' information for cross-reference. She couldn't answer because Evelyn had never told her the father's name. The photographs and train ticket became the only clues to a story she could not decipher. She put everything back in the tin box, hid it in her wardrobe, and every night took it out again, as if waiting for a memory to return. But the more she looked, the more confused everything became. When the snow melted, the house remained silent. No longer the familiar voice giving orders. No longer evening prayers. Neighbors occasionally saw Margaret sitting for hours on the porch, staring toward the lake where cargo ships still passed, carrying distant sounds from places she had never known. Since Evelyn's death, no one came to the house anymore, and no one knew that in the small attic room, the first traces of the truth had appeared. A truth that at the time, no one believed would ever see the light of day. While in Vermont, Margaret lived quietly with questions that remained unanswered. In Massachusetts, William Hughes's life dragged on for many long years in an emptiness that could never be filled. After Margaret, his first wife, lost the ability to recover psychologically and had to remain at St. Luke's nursing facility, he left Newburyport and moved to Cambridge to work for a small mechanical engineering firm. In the beginning, William kept to himself, avoided all social contact, and simply went to work before returning to his narrow rented room. In 1960, at a church social, he met Elizabeth Monroe, a high school teacher who had recently moved from Worcester. Elizabeth was gentle, practical, and patient enough to accept the heavy past of a man who was technically a widower. They married after a year of dating. The wedding was simple, with no close relatives in attendance, only a few colleagues. A year later, Elizabeth gave birth to their first daughter, whom they named Eleanor. For William, it was a new beginning, but not complete liberation. He rarely mentioned Hannah, the first child who had vanished. Yet sometimes, when he heard Eleanor's laughter, he would fall silent, his gaze drifting to the window as if searching for some image in his memory. Elizabeth understood that her husband's past could not be erased, so she chose silence and simply raised their daughter with full love. Eleanor Hughes grew up in Boston during the 1970s, Smart, curious, and different from other children her age in her sensitivity to the things adults left unsaid. At 8 years old, she accidentally discovered an old photograph in her father's desk drawer, a little blonde girl in a red coat, standing in front of a snow-covered wooden house. On the back was written, "Hannah, 1955. When she asked about it, William was quiet for a long time before saying, "That was your sister, but she went far away." That vague answer haunted Eleanor throughout her childhood. She began to notice how her father always reread the same Bible passage every night, or how he sometimes took long bus trips to Newburyport without telling anyone. At 16, Eleanor learned more. Through a distant relative, she heard that her older sister had disappeared under mysterious circumstances in a case that was never solved. From then on, the story became a quiet obsession. She was accepted at Boston University, chose journalism, and specialized in investigative reporting on social issues and criminology. For her senior thesis, she wrote about missing children in New England, 1940-1960, but never mentioned the Hughes family. After graduating, she worked as a reporter for a local paper, focusing on unresolved cases and miscarriages of justice. The deeper she went into the profession, the more she felt pulled back to her own family's story. She collected old newspapers, researched the state's cold case files, and discovered that her sister's 1955 disappearance was listed under Essex County, unresolved. Each time she reread the brief lines from the old articles, she was struck by the silence of time. 4-year-old girl vanishes. No evidence of foul play. She wondered how a person could disappear so completely. By then William was old, spoke even less, and his health was failing. Every February, he still made one trip to Newburyport, lit a small candle on the porch of the old house, then returned home. Eleanor wanted to ask more, but he would only say, "There are things you should leave alone, otherwise you'll find nothing but pain." Even so, her curiosity did not stop. In her small Cambridge apartment, Eleanor began archiving documents and reconstructing the timeline of the case from whatever the press had preserved: the day Hannah disappeared, the investigation steps, the name of the lead sergeant, and the final conclusion: missing minor, no foul play. She carefully copied every detail into a notebook and marked the year 1955 in red ink. When William died in 1985, his few belongings contained only some administrative papers and the faded old photograph. Eleanor kept everything, sealed in a separate envelope. The name Hannah Hughes became an inseparable part of her professional consciousness, a personal story, and a reminder of the limits of traditional investigation. In the years that followed, she tracked other unsolved Massachusetts cases, studied forensic investigation techniques, and archival data analysis. Though she never told anyone, a clear goal had formed inside her: to find out whether in the state's files anything had been overlooked about the child who once carried the Hughes name. The sister she never met but somehow still felt present in the family's memory. In 1990, now 30 years old, and working as an investigative reporter for the Boston Herald, Eleanor Hughes decided to do what she had hesitated to do for years: retrieve the complete original file on her sister's disappearance. The official reason she gave on the access request was research for a series on unsolved Massachusetts cases, but in her heart, it was far more personal than professional. After weeks of correspondence, she received temporary approval from the Essex County Administrative Office that stored criminal records from the 1950s. One April morning she drove to Salem, to the old red brick building with black iron doors on Washington Street. The archive room was in the basement, damp air, the smell of old paper mixed with dust. A middle-aged clerk led her to the rows of metal filing cabinets and handed her the typed index on onion skin paper. When she reached Missing Persons, 1955, her eyes stopped at the line Hughes, Hannah, file number 55-014. She asked to pull the file. The archivist unlocked the cabinet and pulled out a brown cardboard box labeled in red, "Closed." Inside were 3 bundles of papers tied with string, worn hard covers, and a small envelope containing faded Polaroids. Eleanor sat at the reading table, put on the cotton gloves the clerk gave her, and turned each page. The first page was Sergeant Thomas O'Leary's typed report, ending with a handwritten blue ink line, "No foul play established." Every detail she had heard from her father was now concrete: location, evidence, witnesses, case closed date. But what made her pause was a slip of paper clipped inside the second bundle, written in red pencil. Carter, suspicious. Verify address. There was no further note. The name Carter caught her attention. The only person in the file with that surname was a neighbor witness named Evelyn Carter. She flipped back to the witness statement and found E. Carter. Neighbor, female, approx. 40, last seen February 9, 55. Unverified absence. Nothing more about the woman leaving town. O'Leary's margin note simply read, "Unable to locate." Eleanor sat motionless for a long time, then copied the full file number, witness name, and the exact location of the red pencil note. When she left the archive, a clear urge gripped her. She had to find out why Carter had been marked suspicious. In the days that followed, she requested full photocopies of the entire case file, paid the copying fees, and brought everything back to the newsroom for study. She built a detailed timeline: disappearance date, time reported to police, search efforts, FBI involvement, and closure date. Everything matched what her father had told her, except for one thing: Evelyn Carter's disappearance from Newburyport immediately after the incident. In an internal memo between Essex County officers, she found an additional note: neighbor left town before re-interview, possible connection unconfirmed. No one had followed up. The name had not been searched again since 1956. Eleanor began contacting civil records offices to trace the woman's residency records. In the 1960 Vermont State Census appeared an Evelyn Lane, similar age, occupation listed as librarian. The surname Lane felt familiar. If one assumed a name change, it was close to Carter. But in that era, cross-referencing was manual. There were no electronic databases, so she searched year by year through the ledgers. After 2 weeks, she obtained a copy of Evelyn Lane's Vermont residency registration, dated October 1957. Only 2 years after the disappearance. The document proved nothing definitively, but Eleanor could not look away. In her investigation notebook, she wrote, "Evelyn Carter, Evelyn Lane, Vermont 1957. Those lines became the start of a separate personal file, kept apart from her journalism work. Every evening after work, she reviewed the documents, connected timelines, overlaid old Newburyport maps onto Vermont maps, and marked the roughly 200-mile journey. Individually, the details seemed meaningless, but together they formed the faint outline of a journey. The journey of a neighbor who vanished, the same year the child did. In the newsroom, Eleanor kept everything in a private box labeled Hughes Case, Personal. She told no one, only occasionally staring at the words Carter, Suspicious, like an unfinished reminder. That feeling made her understand that what had been folded away in Essex County was not just her family's past, but a missing piece of a story that had never been fully told. In early 2005, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts launched the Cold Case DNA Initiative, a federally funded Department of Justice project to digitize and reanalyze unsolved cases, especially disappearances over 30 years old. News of the program filled local papers and immediately caught the attention of veteran investigative reporters, including Eleanor Hughes. Reading the press release, she realized this might be the rare chance to bring her sister's disappearance back into the official investigative system after half a century of being forgotten. By then, Eleanor was in her mid-40s, the special reports editor at the Boston Herald, with enough law enforcement contacts to gain access. She attended state police press conferences as a journalist, but with a private purpose. When the program began accepting applications from families of long-missing relatives, she immediately submitted one, attaching her father William Hughes's death certificate and her own copies of File 55014 from Essex County. In the case description she wrote clearly, "Missing child, Hannah Hughes, 1955, DNA reference available. She still had William's stored blood sample from a late 1980s Cambridge blood drive. Once reprocessed, it could produce a full genetic profile. In June 2005, she delivered the sample to the State Forensic Lab in Sudbury, signed the transfer form, and received a temporary CODIS identifier, MAH 55014R. The technician told her digitization would take months. Thousands of old cases were waiting. Eleanor left the lab with a strange feeling, as if she had just placed a small stone back into a riverbed that had been dry for decades. While waiting, she tracked the project's progress and noted how the new system would cross-reference DNA between missing persons files and registered living relatives at state and federal levels. One afternoon, while interviewing the director of the Forensic Justice Lab, she was shown a map of the nationwide DNA matching network. Massachusetts was one of the first 8 states in the expanded pilot. Looking at the web of connections on the screen, she understood that for the first time in 50 years, her family's case could be accessed by technology rather than memory. In September, she received official confirmation from the Cold Case Unit, Case File 55014 reclassified under DNA Program, status, pending. The old paper file was digitized, assigned an electronic case number, and entered into the automated matching queue. She returned to Salem once more to watch archivists scan each yellowed page and carefully place the faded Polaroid of the child in the red coat into a digital envelope. The scene moved her, yet she remained professionally calm. When the clerk asked if she wanted to add any note to the system, she simply said, "If there is ever a DNA match, contact me directly." In her personal notebook, she wrote, "CODIS entry confirmed. Hannah Hughes." Afterward, she returned to regular work at the paper, but every time a story broke about a case solved by DNA, she thought of her sister's file number. Over the next 2 years, the state CODIS system processed hundreds of cases. Some yielded results. Most did not. Hannah's remained in the queue, updated every 6 months with the same status, pending. No match. Still, for Eleanor, simply having the file re-entered was a quiet victory. After 50 years, the name Hannah Hughes once again existed in an investigative database, not as faded ink on old paper, but as a real genetic code living inside the modern information system, the last surviving piece of evidence of the child who vanished in the snow of 1955. After File 55014 was entered into the Cold Case DNA program, Eleanor continued her daily work but quietly monitored the system. Every quarter, she received an automated report from the state lab. No new match, sample retained. The message repeated for years until she knew it by heart. Time passed. The DNA project expanded to more states. Thousands of other cases were resolved, but Hannah Hughes's stayed silent. No hits, no matches, no related discoveries. Whenever Massachusetts released its list of cases solved through genetic genealogy, she checked for her sister's name, then closed the laptop with a hollow feeling. William Hughes had died before the program began, but the items he kept, the old photograph, newspaper clippings, a few handwritten notes, remained in the wooden box Eleanor stored on the bottom shelf of her home file cabinet, labeled Family Archive. Every year on his birthday she opened it, reread the scrawled lines, second set of footprints, heading toward the gate. It had become a private memorial ritual, both for her father and for the child he never found. From 2005 to 2010, the notifications arrived regularly, always the same result. Many colleagues advised her to let go, that DNA technology was powerful but not magic, and some profiles might lie dormant forever. She only nodded and said nothing. She understood better than anyone that patience was the core of investigation. When the Cold Case Unit restructured and moved to fully electronic management, she proactively registered her personal contact information for instant notification of any status change. To the outside world, Eleanor was a successful journalist. Inside, she never left 1955. Her articles about missing children in New England were written in a cold, precise tone, with no embellished emotion, yet careful readers sensed the deep obsession beneath the words. Sometimes, Looking at the old investigation maps, she wondered if she was chasing something that never existed. But then she would glance at the printed registration slip bearing the code MAHE 55014R and feel the responsibility to keep it from being forgotten. In the early 2010s, genetic identification technology advanced further, but tracing still depended on relatives entering the databases. No other Hughes family member remained alive to provide a reference sample. Only Williams remained. Eleanor considered submitting her own, and in 2012 she formally did so, signing the consent form at the state lab. Her DNA was added alongside her father's, expanding the matching range. Still, the result remained no match. She continued living in her small Cambridge apartment, working for the paper, teaching part-time archival investigation courses. Occasionally, she was invited to speak at cold case conferences where investigators and journalists discussed new identification technologies. In those sessions, when others talked about cases cracked by luck, she only smiled and never mentioned that she was still waiting for a result that never came. At the end of 2014, nearly a decade after the DNA entry, the Massachusetts cold case system updated its records and moved unmatched long-term cases to pending, long-term archive. That status meant the file still existed, but was no longer actively searched. When she read the notice, Eleanor felt no disappointment, only that a circle of time had closed. Everything stopped there. The Hannah Hughes file remained in the database with the single note case active. She printed the final report, slipped it into an envelope, placed it on her desk beside her father's photograph, and turned off the light. For her, silence was better than a wrong answer. And if she had to wait another 10 years, she was ready, because the existence of that genetic code, even though it had never matched, was proof enough that her family's story had not completely vanished. In February 2015, exactly 60 years after Hannah Hughes disappeared, an event that seemed purely coincidental set off a chain reaction lasting many months. In Vermont, in a small town near Montpelier, a woman named Margaret Lane, now 64 years old, received a promotional email from one of the popular U.S. consumer DNA testing companies. They were offering a discount on their Discover Your Ancestry, Find Lost Relatives program. Margaret, who after years of living alone had grown curious about her family origins, decided to participate. She had little information about her parents, only that her birth certificate was issued in Vermont and listed no father. Deep inside, a vague emptiness had long lingered, questions her late mother Evelyn had never answered. A week later, the kit arrived. She followed the instructions, sent the saliva sample to the lab, and thought nothing more of it. In April, her data was uploaded to the company's National Genealogical Database. During the automated comparison process, the algorithm detected an unusually high genetic similarity with a reference profile in the Massachusetts criminal justice system, code MAH 55014R, belonging to the deceased father of missing child, Hannah Hughes. When the match reached a statistical confidence of 99.97%, the system automatically sent an alert to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, NCMEC, the agency responsible for monitoring unresolved missing child cases involving DNA. The first notification was forwarded to the Massachusetts State Police Cold Case Unit with the note, "Possible family match identified via consumer DNA database." 3 days later, the police received official confirmation from NCMEC. The DNA of Margaret Lane, Vermont resident, matched William Hughes's sample at a near absolute level, consistent with a parent-child relationship. The alert was tagged high priority because it involved a decades-old missing child case. The lieutenant in charge of the cold case unit, Daniel Myers, immediately reopened electronic file 55014C, downloaded the old scans, crime scene photos, and DNA reports. At an emergency meeting the next morning, investigators agreed this could be the first positive result in 60 years for a 1950s Massachusetts child disappearance. NCMEC sent additional summary data. The Margaret Lane sample came from a consumer test, and the user had consented to law enforcement matching. Although formal identity verification was still required, the genetic evidence was strong enough to trigger the two-step confirmation protocol. Massachusetts police contacted NCMEC directly for the user's personal information and contact address. The system responded that the individual was born in 1951 in Vermont and currently resided in the Montpelier area. When Myers read the file, he paused at the birth year, only 2 years off from what Hannah's age would be if she were alive. He immediately ordered a Vermont vital records check. Within 24 hours, the results showed no original Vermont birth record fully matching Margaret Lane's certificate. The document on file had been registered in 1957, 2 years after the Newburyport disappearance. This strengthened the suspicion that the identity Margaret Lane might have been fabricated. Myers drafted a preliminary report, sent it to the state police commander, and requested coordination with NCMEC to open a formal verification investigation. That same day, NCMEC activated its internal reappeared missing child protocol. The central database created reference code NC1955HH and transferred all information to the Massachusetts Department of Justice. By April 17, the DNA technicians at Sudbury officially confirmed Margaret Lane's sample matched both William Hughes's and Eleanor Hughes's stored CODIS profiles at 99.98%. The result was double-checked at the FBI lab in Quantico for legal validity. When the final report was signed, the system triggered a red alert, match confirmed, subject possibly identified as Hannah Hughes. The notification went simultaneously to NCMEC, the Boston FBI field office, and the Massachusetts Cold Case Unit. That same morning, Myers and his team received a call from NCMEC headquarters. This is the oldest cold case child match ever recorded in the state. The agencies agreed to keep the information confidential while conducting on-site verification in Vermont. A small task force was formed, state police, NCMEC representatives, and DNA analysts responsible for confirming the identity of the woman calling herself Margaret Lane. Copies of her birth record, Evelyn Lane's death certificate, and residency documents were urgently requested for comparison. Inside the investigation room, the detectives said little, only exchanging silent looks at the printout, an endless string of genetic code that to them was the answer to a case forgotten for 6 decades. In the closing report of the initial verification phase, Myers wrote, "DNA link established between Hughes family and subject Margaret Lane. Further confirmation required." In the top left corner of the page was a red stamp, case reopened, 2015. 2 days after the CODIS and NCMEC systems confirmed the match, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children sent an official notification to the registered contact for file 55014, journalist Eleanor Hughes. The first email came from an internal center address with the subject line, "Potential DNA match, case 55014C. When she opened it, Eleanor saw only a few short lines. "A civilian DNA sample has matched the relative data in the Hughes file. We need to verify contact information before providing further details." She paused, rereading it, her heart pounding in her chest. After 10 years of nothing but no match, this was the first time the system had sent a positive alert. She immediately called the Cold Case Unit office in Sudbury, which oversaw the program, and was connected to Lieutenant Daniel Myers. His voice was calm, but couldn't hide the urgency. "We just received official confirmation from NCMEC. There's a woman in Vermont named Margaret Lane, whose DNA matches your father's sample. We're conducting preliminary verification. Can you be ready to cooperate?" Eleanor agreed instantly. Within 24 hours, she received a list of authentication questions from the forensics lab. They asked her to resubmit family identification details, former addresses, medical events, photographs, even genetic anomalies or distinctive hereditary traits. She sent everything overnight, including a photo of her father's hand showing the small scar on his index finger, a detail already recorded in medical files. 3 days later, the analysis team confirmed that the woman named Margaret Lane had a birthmark in the exact location described for baby Hannah in 1955, just below the left shoulder blade, nearly identical in size. All biological markers, age, blood type, and estimated height matched. The statistical results in the internal report showed a 99.98% probability of blood relation between the two individuals. NSAMEC sent Eleanor a summary, asking her to reconfirm family data and sign authorization to proceed with expanded verification. During their first online call, Myers briefly explained the process. We need to confirm the DNA match corresponds to the actual identity, because in some cases civilian genealogy data can be skewed if someone registered under a false name. However, all signs point to this being authentic. He asked her to provide additional documents proving direct relation to William Hughes, including birth and death certificates. Eleanor completed everything that day and sent scans through a secure channel. While waiting for a response, she couldn't focus on anything else. Every phone ring made her heart tighten. The feeling was a mix of excitement and fear, because if it was true, it meant the sister she had never met might still be alive somewhere. On April 23rd, Myers called back, "You should sit down before I say this." He announced the preliminary results. Margaret Lane's DNA matched William's and Eleanor's, absolutely confirming father-daughter sibling relationship. Per protocol, Case 55-014C was moved to reopened verification phase. A team of investigators was assigned to gather information on the person identified as Margaret Lane in Vermont, including residence history, medical records, and identification documents. Meanwhile, Eleanor was invited to NMEC headquarters in Boston to sign the relative confirmation document. She sat in a small conference room, staring at the whiteboard that read Case 55-014C, match pending verification, feeling as if time had frozen. After signing her name, she asked Myers, "Could there be a mistake?" He shook his head. "No. We double-checked with 2 independent labs. Genetically, you and that woman share the same father." That evening, Eleanor returned to Cambridge and opened her father's old wooden box. The black and white photo of the child in the red coat was still there, faded with time. She placed the DNA confirmation notice next to it, looked at the 2 objects, one from the past, one from the present, and sat motionless for a very long time. All the years she had persistently tracked the file, taken notes, and copied every page suddenly converged in a single moment. The absolute silence of the room and the realization that somewhere in Vermont, a woman carrying the same blood was living, unaware she had once been the child who vanished in the snow of 1955. Immediately after the genetic match was preliminarily confirmed, the Massachusetts State Police, in coordination with NSAMEC, sent a request to collect a direct DNA sample from the woman known as Margaret Lane for official forensic testing. On April 27, 2015, 2 federal agents from the investigative unit and a state forensic specialist were authorized to travel to Vermont. They contacted the local Montpelier Police Department and presented the collection order as identity verification in a national missing child case. The meeting was arranged discreetly to avoid media attention. When they arrived, Margaret was cooperative but confused, not understanding why she was being asked to provide a DNA test. She said she had only participated in a civilian testing program to find distant relatives and never expected it to lead to law enforcement contact. The record noted, subject calm, non-resistant, agreed to provide sample. A blood sample was taken at the Washington County Health Center, sealed, signed, and flown to the FBI Forensic Laboratory in Quantico, Virginia. While awaiting results, the file remained in pending verification status. At Quantico, analysis followed strict protocol. Margaret Lane's blood DNA was extracted and run in parallel comparison against the 2 reference samples from William and Eleanor Hughes, stored in CODIS. Genetic markers at 24 loci were compared, every step documented, photographed, and sealed. After 5 days, the lab completed the analysis and sent the report directly to Massachusetts. Probability of parentage, 99.983%. Probability of sibling relation, 99.979%. Genetic confirmation, true. The word true was typed in capital letters, stamped with the red FBI seal. That same day, an electronic copy was sent to NSEM AP and the Cold Case Unit. Lieutenant Daniel Myers read the report in his office, sat silently for a long time, then called Eleanor. His voice was low but firm. The Quantico results just came in. Absolute confirmation. Genetically, she is Hannah. At the same time, a summary was sent to the FBI Boston field office for filing. In Quantico's final report, the conclusion was brief. The missing child Hannah Hughes and the subject known as Margaret Lane are genetically identical. Identity confirmed. By May 4th, the Massachusetts State Police officially issued an internal memo. Identity of the victim in the 1955 missing person case has been established. File status changed from missing, unresolved, to identified, survivor. All documents, samples, and test results were recategorized under the new designation. A closed-door meeting was held at the Cold Case Unit with representatives from NSEMEC, the FBI, and the State Prosecutor's Office. The agencies agreed to keep the information confidential until full legal identity verification was complete. The supplemental investigation report detailed the matching process, sample collection sequence, storage conditions, quantitative results, and statistical evaluation. Under national forensic standards, the identity determination was considered absolutely valid, equivalent to biological record verification. At the bottom of the final signature page, the Quantico lab director added a note. This represents one of the oldest verified genetic matches in U.S. missing person history. In Boston, Eleanor received a copy of the results through internal courier. She read every line, feeling it was both real and unreal. The cold numbers, 99.98, 3%, 99.97, 9%, were living proof of what her family had waited half a century for. She sent thanks to Myers, then sat alone in her office, looking out the window where the last snow of the season was slowly melting on the opposite roof. In Vermont, local police also received the official identity confirmation notice. In the record closing the verification phase, the Massachusetts State Forensic Director wrote the final line. Identification complete. Subject recognized as Hannah Hughes, missing child reported 1955. Case transferred to Massachusetts Cold Case Unit for further proceedings. From that moment, the name Hannah Hughes officially re-entered the justice system after 60 years erased from the living records. After forensic identity was confirmed, the FBI, in coordination with the Massachusetts State Police, proceeded to the next phase, interviewing the surviving witness, now identified as Hannah Hughes. The first interview took place on May 10, 2015, at the Washington County Sheriff's Office in Vermont, attended by 2 FBI agents, a forensic psychologist, and an NPINMIC representative. The purpose, as recorded, was memory verification and completion of the identity investigation file. Hannah, still accustomed to being called Margaret Lane, entered the room cautiously, sat at the wooden table, sunlight from the window falling on her thin face and hair that mixed gray with remnants of old gold. She was formally told that DNA testing had confirmed she was the person missing from the 1955 case in Newburyport, Massachusetts. Her first reaction was silence. After a long pause, she asked softly, "Am I really that child?" The lead agent confirmed it and placed a copy of the Quantico results certificate in front of her. Hannah took the paper with trembling hands, eyes welling up, and only whispered, "She lied to me." That sentence opened a 4-plus-hour interview in which she recounted the few childhood memories that remained. According to her, her earliest memory was not Vermont, but a pale yellow house with a white fence, where a man often carried her on his shoulders and a young woman in an apron usually sat by the window. She remembered a snowy morning, riding a tricycle, then a strange woman in a dark coat came, spoke to her mother at the gate, and said she would take her to buy candy. When asked for more details, Hannah said she remembered holding that person's hand, cold but gripping very tightly. Then she recalled a train ride and the heavy smell of smoke. The agent noted, "Witness clearly remembers a sequence of events matching the 1955 case data: the house, tricycle, middle-aged woman, train travel." When asked about the woman she had called mother for 60 years, Hannah said, "Evelyn Lane, real name Evelyn Carter, always forbade her from going outside, and repeatedly told the same story, that they had to leave Massachusetts because her father died in an accident and no one else was left alive." She admitted that after Evelyn died in 1979, she had found an old train ticket, a black and white photo, and an irregular birth certificate in a tin box, but didn't understand their meaning. Every detail matched the original case evidence: the 1955 Newburyport train ticket, the forged birth certificate listing Randall as the birth witness, and the photo of Evelyn with the child in the red coat. When investigators showed her copies of the crime scene photos, she went very still for a long time, then pointed to the tricycle. "I pushed it every morning. My dad once fixed the handlebar." Interview note: Witness accurately identified evidence without prompting. In the second session, the forensic psychology team tested latent memories through controlled questions about sounds, colors, and smells. Hannah clearly described the smell of coffee and the sound of morning knocking, details confirmed in Margaret Hughes's original 1955 statement when she said she was making coffee when her child disappeared. The experts assessed probability of random coincidence below 1%. Witness possesses authentic memories, not induced imagination. When asked about her feelings toward Evelyn, she said she felt no hatred, only emptiness. "She lived in fear, but I never understood what she was afraid of." At the end of the interview, she signed the record acknowledging her legal identity as Hannah Hughes, born 1951, Newburyport, Massachusetts. The 32-page transcript was forwarded to the Massachusetts State Police, along with audio files and the investigation team's evaluation. In the summary sent to Boston, the lead agent wrote, "Witness memories align with scene documents and identified non-public case elements. Probability of identity error, 0." The official report to the state police chief stated, "Interview complete. Victim Hannah Hughes survived, currently residing in Vermont." Witness confirmed elements matching the 1955 file, based on forensic evidence and testimony. Identity legally recognized. Attached was a recommendation to keep personal information confidential until all legal steps and notification of surviving relatives were completed. In the cold case unit office, Myers read the report's conclusion, then quietly set it down. All the numbers, maps, and photos they had chased for months now had a real voice. The voice of a woman who had once been the child lost in that snowy winter, telling the very story preserved in files for 60 years that no one ever believed anyone would still remember. Immediately after the FBI completed the interview and sent the identity confirmation to the Massachusetts State Police, File 55014 was officially reopened for investigation, under the special protocol for unresolved cases with a confirmed living victim. On May 18, 2015, the Massachusetts State Police Chief signed the order restoring the entire original Hannah Hughes missing person file, changing its status from identified survivor to active cold case investigation. A task force named Hughes Task Force was formed, led by Lieutenant Daniel Myers, including representatives from NSMEC, FBI Boston, the State Forensic Lab, and 2 investigators from Essex County. The first meeting took place in a small conference room in Boston, where old documents were spread across the table. A 1955 Newburyport map, faded scene photos, and the list of involved persons. Myers opened the meeting with a short sentence: "We have a surviving victim, but we don't have a perpetrator." The team's mission was to re-examine every old investigative lead, verify statements, and identify who was responsible for the abduction. They started with the witness list: Evelyn Carter, neighbor, last person to see the victim; William and Margaret Hughes, parents, the original investigators, and indirect witnesses. All reports were backed up and digitally scanned for easier comparison. A civil records team was assigned to trace documents related to Evelyn Carter: birth records, residence registrations, taxes, and property. Initial results showed she left Massachusetts in 1956 and resettled in Vermont under the new name Evelyn Lane, perfectly matching the information Hannah provided in her interview. This evidence strengthened the hypothesis that Evelyn was the person who took the child from Newburyport. Myers asked the legal team to request a search warrant for Evelyn's former home in Montpelier, where she lived until her death in 1979. Per procedure, the warrant required Vermont court approval, since the property was outside Massachusetts jurisdiction. In the court filing, the task force presented grounds, DNA results, victim testimony, and preserved evidence such as the Newburyport train ticket and forged birth certificate. On May 25, the Washington County Court approved the request, issuing a warrant to search and seize evidence at 148 West Hill Road, Montpelier. While awaiting execution, the task force continued reviewing secondary figures. Most officers from the 1955 investigation had passed away, but their personnel files remained. They compared Sergeant Thomas O'Leary's original notes with Hannah's account. The timelines matched remarkably, especially the detail of the woman in the fur hat, described in both old statements, and the victim's memory. The forensic analysis team reconstructed the suspect's likely route from Merrimack Street to Newburyport Station, 2.3 miles, consistent with the train ticket found in the tin box. Analysis of terrain and 1955 train schedules showed the Newburyport, White River Junction morning line matched Hannah's memory of the train and smoke smell. These data were added to the supplemental report submitted with the search warrant. At the same time, the forensic team digitized all remaining physical evidence stored in the Essex warehouse, Polaroid photos, scene reports, and the red cloth fragment collected at the Hughes gate. Though too old for DNA testing, the fibers were microscopically scanned for future material comparison if matching samples were found in Vermont. All data were entered into an electronic retrieval system, creating a new investigation file numbered 55014R/2015. On May 30th, Myers received the fax confirmation from the Vermont court, warrant approved, valid for 10 days, permitting evidence collection, excavation, and structural inspection on the Evelyn Lane property. He immediately notified NCMEC and the FBI and planned coordinated execution. Before leaving Boston, the task force held a final briefing to assign roles: forensics team for on-site sample collection, records team for document and neighborhood witness verification, and FBI for federal security and legal oversight. In the operations plan, Myers wrote the final line: objective, establish origin, means, and motive. Every remaining trace of Evelyn Carter has value. As the convoy prepared to depart, he looked back at the Newburyport map on the wall, marked with a single red dot, the small house that had been the case's starting point. 60 years later, that file was fully restored, and for the first time since the little girl vanished in the snow of 1955, Massachusetts law enforcement officially had the chance to trace backward along the path of the woman once known as Evelyn Carter. On the morning of June 2, 2015, the Hughes task force arrived in Montpelier, Vermont, to execute the search warrant approved by the Washington County Court. The wooden house at 148 West Hill Road sat on nearly an acre of land, surrounded by old maple trees and a moss-covered yard that appeared untouched for years. The house number was rusted, windows shuttered, and the porch roof sagged heavily to one side. The investigation team, working with Vermont police and Massachusetts state forensic specialists, set up a scene tent and cordoned off a 50-meter radius from the back door, the area Hannah had described as the yard her mother forbade her to approach. Technicians mapped the ground with ground-penetrating radar to locate anomalies beneath the old soil. After 2 hours, the GPR detected an unusual metallic reflection at approximately 1.2 meters depth, 15 meters from the house toward the forest edge. The excavation team began digging by hand. The topsoil was damp and carried a faint gasoline smell. At 14:10, the first part of the object emerged, a curved metal frame resembling a wheel well. As they dug deeper, they uncovered the rusted body of a vintage car, a 1953 Buick, with the engine removed and the roof cut off. The partial VIN was still legible. After cleaning, technicians confirmed it matched the license plate of a Buick reported stolen in New Hampshire in 1956. Registered to R. Carter. The task force immediately sealed the area, noting vehicle fragment, probable disposal unit. Inside the trunk, beneath mud and decayed leaves, they found a dark cloth bag containing several rotted items: leather gloves, an aluminum comb, a paper fragment embossed Randall, and most significantly, a remaining piece of red fabric, thick wool with singed edges. The fabric sample was placed in an evidence bag labeled Item 7, Red Textile Fragment. Technicians performed a preliminary visual comparison and noted the wool had a classic 1950s weave pattern and color, matching the fragment preserved in the original Hughes case evidence from Essex. For confirmation, the sample was taken to the on-site temporary lab and examined under an optical microscope for fiber twist and fading. Initial results showed a 95% characteristic match. Inside the house, the legal team searched the basement and discovered numerous wooden crates containing old papers, receipts, invoices, several handwritten notebooks in feminine script, and a small photo packet from the late 1950s showing a curly-haired woman in a fur hat, matching the Ruth Johnson witness description. Another photo showed the same Buick parked in front of this house, plate matching the excavated frame. All were sealed. While continuing excavation at the rear of the car, the forensic team found thin wire framing, likely from removed rear seats, and among the rotted upholstery layers, another item, a child's red wool sweater with mother-of-pearl buttons detached from the yarn. Though deformed, the collar retained its distinctive spiral knit pattern. The lead forensic officer immediately compared it to the 1955 Hughes case evidence photo: sweater, red wool, missing one button. The detail matched perfectly. The sweater was sealed separately and sent to the lab for fiber testing and possible residual DNA analysis. The entire scene was kept sealed for 2 additional days for thorough excavation. Besides the Buick, the team recovered a metal cabinet frame, a toolbox, and a rusted gas can. No human remains were found, but in a basement wall cavity, they retrieved a small leather-bound notebook containing scrawled lines. "The child is safe now. No one can take her again. We are leaving Massachusetts forever." At the bottom of the last page were the initials EC. The notebook's discovery was recorded as evidence item 11. At the end of the 3rd day, the entire scene was photographed, 3D scanned, and all evidence transported to the Massachusetts State Lab for examination. The 18-page preliminary report sent to Myers confirmed recovered vehicle and textile consistent with temporal and geographic parameters of 1955 Hughes case. Probability of material match, 97%. Upon reading the report, Myers added only one line to his log: 60 years, and the red sweater is still there. In Montpelier, the property at 148 West Hill Road remained sealed pending analysis results, while in the investigation file, the Hannah Hughes case officially had its first physical evidence since the day the child disappeared in the snow of 1955. The leather-bound notebook recovered from a wall cavity in the basement of the house in Montpelier was urgently transferred to the Massachusetts State Police Crime Laboratory, along with other items of evidence. After cleaning, the forensic team discovered that, in addition to the visibly decayed pages, many layers of paper inside had been fused together, likely due to years of damp and mold. Using infrared spectroscopy scanning technology, technicians were able to restore nearly the entire contents, 43 handwritten pages, in a woman's script that matched administrative documents bearing the name Evelyn Carter. The entries spanned from late 1954 to roughly mid-1957, exactly the period immediately before and after the disappearance. The notebook opened with short, disjointed lines: "Cannot have a child. They say it's from old complications, but I know it is punishment." This was followed by passages describing violently fluctuating moods and repeated phrases such as, "Must have the child. God is testing us. If I care for it, the sin will be erased." Reviewing psychologists who read the transcript unanimously assessed that the author exhibited signs of psychotic disorder, an obsession with motherhood, and religious guilt. Midway through the notebook, the writing became more concrete. "I saw the little girl, blonde hair, red coat, in the yard across the street. Her mother is too busy. Her father is away. The chance comes only once. If I do it gently, no one will know." On the page below was a strange symbol, later identified as a hand-drawn route from Merrimack Street to Newburyport Station, drawn in blue ink, with the note, 9:05 train, ticket ready. Subsequent pages described the plan in greater detail, preparing the car, using the false name Ruth Johnson, and approaching the Hughes family through a newspaper babysitting advertisement. At the bottom of page 22, a scrawled line read, "She believed me, said she had to go to work. Monday, when the snow falls, I will bring the child home." This constituted direct evidence that the abduction was premeditated, not a spontaneous act. In the remaining portion of the notebook, after March 1955, the tone became more disordered and paranoid. Evelyn wrote, "It cries at night, calls for its mother. I teach it to call me mother. I must erase everything from before. No one must find it." Another passage read, "I hear them knocking. Cars in the street. They've come to take it back. Must leave now. Vermont train, God bless." These entries matched perfectly with police timeline records showing she left Newburyport only days after the disappearance. Toward the end of the notebook, the handwriting turned frantic and remorseful. "I only wanted to be a mother, but the dream is fading. It grows and looks at me with different eyes. I fear the day it remembers." From the final page, the forensic team extracted a hair stuck between the paper edges. DNA testing confirmed it belonged to an adult female and matched the profile of Evelyn Lane, proving ownership of the notebook. When the results reached Myers, he immediately convened the task force. The forensic psychologist's report concluded that Evelyn Carter suffered from delusional disorder with religious compensatory features and reproductive obsession. Medical records, located at Worcester State Hospital from 1948, showed she had been treated for infertility and depression following a miscarriage. Based on all evidence, the task force determined the primary motive for the abduction was the desperate need to become a mother due to infertility, combined with mental illness, with no elements of ransom or violence. At the summary meeting on June 8, Myers read aloud an excerpt from page 19. "If I love it enough, God will forgive." He closed the notebook, looked around the room and said, "This is no longer a missing person case. This is a premeditated abduction with a clear motive." Other physical evidence, train tickets, photographs of the Buick, the forged birth certificate, were all treated as components of the plan. In the official report submitted to the state prosecutor, the task force concluded, "Diary recovered at the scene clearly establishes abduction motive and proves premeditated conduct carried out by Evelyn Carter. The case possesses sufficient legal grounds to be classified child abduction, non-violent, pre-planned." The report was stamped confirmed findings with the note, "Personal documents match 1955 timeline, reflect severe psychological state and detailed action plan." Evelyn's notebook, hidden inside a wall for 6 decades, had become the central piece that reconstructed the entire mechanism of the crime, a confession without words, powerful enough to answer the question left open in file 55014 for 60 years, why a child vanished, and why no one ever found her. During analysis of Evelyn's notebook, the forensic team noticed a name that appeared repeatedly in entries from January to April 1955, Randall. Initially thought to be meaningless notation, cross-referencing revealed that Randall matched the name of the certifying official printed on the forged birth certificate of Margaret Lane, the document Hannah had found in the tin box after Evelyn's death. This coincidence led Myers to order a review of Vermont civil records from the same period. The search revealed that at that time there was a social welfare employee named Joseph Randall, born 1914, who worked in the Vermont Office of Civil Registry in Montpelier, responsible for certifying births, deaths, and migrant residency records. When investigators requested his personnel file, they discovered he had been disciplined in 1958 for violations of document verification procedures, though the specific file had long been archived. The FBI reopened the civil service file under posthumous review due to involvement in document forgery related to a child abduction case. In the Federal Office of Personnel Management archives, they located an old folder containing a disciplinary memo stating, "Confirmed several birth records lacking original documentation." Among 5 flagged cases, one name was partially redacted: Lane, Margaret, 1957. This proved Randall was the official who issued or validated the forged birth certificate for the abducted child at Evelyn's request. Entries in Evelyn's notebook from the same period clarified the connection. R agreed to help. He said all it takes is a thick enough envelope, the paper will have the seal. Investigators interpreted this as Evelyn bribing Randall to create legal paperwork that legitimized the child's new identity. Further FBI searches revealed Randall retired in 1960 and died of a stroke in 1972 in Burlington, Vermont, with no direct surviving relatives. At the time of his death, old administrative documents had been recovered from his home, but never investigated further because no open case existed. Now, the evidence in Evelyn's diary allowed authorities to identify Randall as the sole administrative accomplice who directly enabled Evelyn to maintain the false identity. Margaret Lane. Myers ordered a cross-check of all Vermont birth certificates issued 1955, 1960, for similar irregularities. The summary report showed only one record bearing an identical seal to Margaret's, a seal discontinued in early 1956. Forensic analysis confirmed the ink and paper matched samples known to have been used by Randall. The concluding memo sent to the Department of Justice began, "Evidence suggests direct participation by civil employee Joseph Randall in falsification of birth record used by suspect Evelyn Carter, aka Lane." However, because Randall had been dead for over 40 years and the statute of limitations for administrative prosecution had expired, the file was reclassified as posthumous review for evidentiary purposes only. The FBI's final 26-page report on Randall detailed the informal relationship between him and Evelyn Carter, multiple meetings at the Montpelier office, and an unreported cash transaction. An unsent handwritten letter found in Randall's archived papers read, "I didn't think it would become this serious. She said she only wanted a child to care for. I did it out of pity." It was signed Jr. The investigation concluded Randall did not directly participate in the abduction itself, but provided the legal facilitation that allowed Evelyn to keep the child undetected for decades. In the joint report to the Massachusetts and Vermont state prosecutors, the task force wrote, "Social welfare employee Joseph Randall, deceased 1972, is confirmed as an administrative accomplice in the falsification of a birth record. Matter closed under posthumous review, no prosecution, recorded as precedent." Myers reread the final line and underlined 3 words, "No one was innocent." With Randall's role established, the full picture of the crime became clearer, not merely the solitary act of a disturbed woman, but a quiet systemic failure in which one signature was enough to erase a child's true identity for 60 years. In July 2015, after the investigation into Evelyn Carter and employee Randall was complete, the FBI and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children officially closed the criminal phase and moved to the humanitarian phase, family reunification. The decision to arrange a meeting between Hannah Hughes and her younger sister Eleanor was approved at the Boston Cold Case Unit, supervised by psychologists and NMEC representatives. On July 21st, a small room in the Federal Building in Cambridge was prepared: a round wooden table, 2 bottles of water, soft lighting, no media cameras or reporters. The agencies wanted to ensure complete privacy. When Hannah entered, her silver hair tied back, still wearing the same gray wool scarf around her neck, her hands trembled slightly. Eleanor was already seated, an old photograph of their father in his younger days placed in front of her. The door closed, and for the first few seconds, no one spoke, only breathing and eyes meeting. Then Eleanor stood, holding the photograph, and whispered, "Hannah?" The woman across from her stared for a long time, as if searching for memories in a face 30 years younger than her own. Finally, Hannah nodded, eyes red. "You have Daddy's eyes." That moment was recorded in the official notes as time of emotional identification established. The two women embraced. No words could bridge 60 years of separation. Afterward, following protocol, the FBI conducted final DNA verification to document direct blood relation in the official file. The sisters were taken to the state lab in Sudbury, where they provided buccal swabs. Testing was performed simultaneously at two independent laboratories. 3 days later, results showed a 99.982% genetic match, confirming they were full siblings. The report was immediately forwarded to the prosecutor and NMEC, with the note, "DNA verification complete, familial confirmation established." In a subsequent internal meeting, the Massachusetts State Police Commissioner signed the document officially changing the status of Case 55-014 from missing, unresolved to found alive, verified. That status appeared on NCMEC's national database, becoming one of the longest resolved missing child cases in U.S. history. In the remarks field, system staff added, "Case duration 60 years, 5 months, 17 days. Eleanor never forgot that number. When informed, she only said softly, "Daddy waited his whole life for this." The formal reunion took place privately a few days later, attended by key investigators and NCMEC representatives. They chose a small house on the banks of the Charles River, not far from where William Hughes had spent his final years. Hannah sat across from Eleanor, listening to stories of a family she had never known. The father, who worked as a mechanic, the mother who lived the rest of her life in depression, and the little sister who grew up with only an old photograph. When Eleanor showed her a picture of the Merrimack Street house taken in 1955, Hannah touched the edge of the photo, and tears fell unchecked. She whispered, "You know, I still dream about the white fence. I thought it was just my imagination." Eleanor took her hand and answered, "It was real. I found it again for you." The conversation lasted nearly 3 hours, interspersed with long silences in which the two women simply looked at each other, recognizing the same gestures, the same eyes, even the same smile. The psychologist noted, "Natural response, no coercion. Emotional reactions consistent with long-term familial reunion." When the meeting ended, Hannah said she wanted to visit Massachusetts to see where her parents had lived, just once. The FBI and NCMEC agreed to arrange the trip under the Family Reconnection Program. On July 25, the sisters, accompanied by agency representatives, drove to Newburyport. Merrimack Street had changed. The old house was now painted pale blue, a new white fence replacing the original. Hannah stood at the gate for a long time, silent, resting her hand on the wood and closing her eyes. A forensic officer wrote in the field log, "Subject recognized location," without prompting. Eleanor stepped forward and placed a bouquet of white daisies on the lawn. They stood quietly as a light wind moved through the trees. Afterward, NCMEC prepared a family reunion report, detailing every step: genetic verification, personal reunion, and status update to found alive. The document was over 40 pages long and included photographs and both sisters' signatures. At the closing meeting, Lieutenant Myers said simply, "Not many cases reach this final line. This is the result of 60 years of waiting and a family that never gave up." On July 30, 2015, the national database officially listed Case 55-014 under Recovered Missing Children, resolved. The internal announcement ended with one sentence: Hannah Hughes reported missing 1955, located alive 2015, identity verified. When Eleanor read it, she folded the paper, looked up at her sister, once only a shadow in a file, now flesh and blood, and in that rare moment all the pages, numbers, and dry reports suddenly meant something else. They were no longer just a case file, but the story of a human being found after a lifetime lost. In August 2015, after all verification, forensic analysis, and reunification procedures were complete, the Massachusetts State Police and the Federal Bureau of Investigation officially closed Case 55-014 with a 186-page final report. The closing briefing was held at the Cold Case Unit headquarters in Boston, attended by NCMEC representatives, forensic specialists, investigators, and everyone directly involved in the reinvestigation. Lieutenant Daniel Myers chaired the meeting and began with a simple statement: 60 years later, we have the answer. He presented the final report to the assembly. The sole perpetrator was identified as Evelyn Carter, also known as Evelyn Lane, resident of Montpelier, Vermont, deceased 1979. The report rested on 4 primary sources: the personal diary recovered from Evelyn's home, physical evidence, the surviving victim's statements, and forged administrative documents provided by civil employee Joseph Randall. The entire chain of evidence was reconstructed and matched perfectly with the timeline and original 1955 evidence. The findings section stated clearly, suspect Evelyn Carter intentionally planned and executed the abduction of minor Hannah Hughes on February 9, 1955, with premeditated actions involving false identity, transportation across state lines, and falsification of birth records. Authorities concluded this was a deliberate, meticulously prepared abduction with no violence but constituting identity theft. The psychological analysis emphasized Evelyn's primary motive: prolonged infertility, mental disorder accompanied by religious delusion, maternal obsession, and the belief that love would atone for sin. Diary passages revealed her inner conflict from desperate longing to fear of discovery. The report confirmed she acted alone, with no direct accomplices in the abduction itself, except for the posthumously identified administrative assistance of Joseph Randall, deceased 1972. Under motivation and psychological profile, the forensic team concluded, subject exhibited signs consistent with delusional maternal fixation, guilt-induced psychosis, and dissociative reasoning, leading to child abduction, as perceived Salvation Act. The report detailed the decades-long concealment, name change, purchase of the Vermont house, forged birth certificate, and complete isolation of the child from the outside world. This behavior was assessed as neurotic control, no physical abuse but causing prolonged psychological harm to the victim. When the conclusion was read, Myers paused, looked at the final line: legal status, case closed, solved, suspect, deceased. No further prosecution. Below it was the red stamp: solved, deceased, suspect. The report also recommended adding the case to state training curricula for long-term missing persons cases and psychological profiles leading to non-profit motivated abductions. During the meeting, the NCMEC representative stated, "This is proof of the power of interagency investigation and modern DNA technology." A case thought forever forgotten has found closure through science and family persistence. The complete file was digitized and archived in the National Cold Case Database under Resolved Child Abductions 20th Century. Outside the briefing room, Eleanor and Hannah were present as the final witnesses to a process that had spanned more than half a century. When handed copies of the report, they simply looked at each other in silence. On the cover page, beneath Commonwealth of Massachusetts Final Investigation Report, Myers had written by hand, "Sometimes justice arrives not through punishment, but through the recovery of truth." On August 3, 2015, the Hannah Hughes case was officially closed. The public release to federal agencies and media contained only 3 lines. The 1955 disappearance of Hannah Hughes, Newburyport, Massachusetts, has been resolved. Perpetrator identified as Evelyn Carter, deceased 1979. Case closed, solved, deceased suspect. In the NPEC system, the final status read, found a live case solved. 60 years of waiting ended with a simple sentence, yet behind it lay an entire life erased from the map, and then found again, not in the darkness of crime, but in the belated light of final truth. News that the Hannah Hughes disappearance had been solved, after 60 years spread across the United States, within 2 days of the Massachusetts State Police releasing the official report. Major outlets, the New York Times, Associated Press and national networks, CNN, NBC, CBS, all covered the longest missing child case in U.S. history, solved by DNA. Photographs of the two women embracing at the Cambridge reunion appeared on front pages with headlines such as "The Child in the Snow, Found After 60 Years." Social media shared the story as a modern miracle, combining science and perseverance. True crime forums, criminology groups, and psychology communities discussed it as a landmark in genetic investigative work. NPEC quickly incorporated the Hannah Hughes case into its new cold case reconnection training program, presenting it to hundreds of investigators from other states. At a Washington, D.C. press conference, the NPEC director said, "Technology is only part of it. The human element is the core. Without Eleanor Hughes's determination, this case would have remained forgotten forever." Internal NTEC reports noted a 38% increase in reopened cold case submissions in the 3 months following the publicity. Public reaction, however, was not unanimous. Some commentators argued that publicly naming Evelyn Carter, though long dead, raised privacy and ethical concerns. Editorials asked whether justice was truly served when the perpetrator could never answer for the crime. Readers wrote to the Boston Herald, where Eleanor once worked, expressing sympathy, but pointing out that Evelyn's actions stemmed from mental illness rather than malice, and that revisiting the case merely satisfied belated curiosity. Meanwhile, investigators and forensic experts viewed it as a major advance in DNA archiving and utilization. Numerous scientific conferences cited the Hughes case as a textbook example of CODIS value and federal coordination. Harvard University hosted a special symposium titled "Justice After Time: When Science Overcomes the Limits of Forgetting," attended by Eleanor. She spoke briefly. "My father used to say truth has no statute of limitation. Now I understand what he meant." That quote was reprinted across news sites and became emblematic of the case. Yet dissenting voices persisted. Some Vermont residents, where Evelyn spent most of her life, expressed skepticism and defended the neighbor they remembered as quiet but kind. On the Montpelier Community Forum, many wrote that Evelyn Lane was a private but good woman, and that dredging up the past only hurt those who had known her. Television specials dramatized the emotional journey, giving the story a tragic, sympathetic tone that left viewers conflicted between guilt and humanity. Ethicists debated the concept of delayed justice, whether establishing truth after the perpetrator's death constituted real justice or merely societal consolation. The Atlantic published a long essay titled "The Weight of Time in Justice," arguing justice is not always synonymous with punishment. Sometimes telling the truth is the only way to heal. Within NEMMEC, the Hannah Hughes case became the model for integrating civilian data with the justice system in missing persons searches. Trainees in the 2016 cold case course were required to reanalyze it as a standard exercise. In its year-end summary, NMEC classified it as a case of national impact. Simultaneously, the Massachusetts Cold Case Unit received hundreds of requests from other victims' families to reopen old files. The ripple effect extended beyond law enforcement into a broader cultural phenomenon. Documentary filmmakers, publishers, and television producers competed for rights to the story. Eleanor steadfastly refused all commercial projects, agreeing only to appear in NMEC professional training sessions, where she said, "I don't want anyone to see my sister as a tragic character. I only want them to understand that truth always has value, no matter how late it arrives." At the final NMEC press conference, the director concluded, "Hannah Hughes is not just a victim who was found. She is a symbol of memory, of science, and of the human heart that refuses to give up." Beneath those words, the slide on screen read, "Case 55-014, resolved." Lessons: never close the door on the missing. After the public furor died down and all legal procedures were finalized, Hannah Hughes, now 64 years old, decided to leave Vermont, where she had lived most of her life, under the name Margaret Lane, and return to Massachusetts. The decision was not easy. The old land was tied to memories that had been erased, yet it was also the place that held her true roots. With support from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, NCMEC, and the Reintegration Program for Victims of Long-Term Abductions, Hannah was placed in a small apartment on the outskirts of Salem, near the Cold Case Unit office, where her file had been stored for 60 years. The first weeks of her new life left her both disoriented and exhausted. Assigned psychologists conducted regular check-ins and established a 6-month treatment plan. The initial therapy session took place in a room with a window overlooking a garden. When asked how she felt at that moment, Hannah replied, "I still don't know who I am between the two names." That statement was recorded in the therapy report as a typical manifestation of interrupted identity syndrome following prolonged captivity. The doctors diagnosed her with moderate post-traumatic stress disorder and dissociative identity disturbance. The treatment protocol focused on helping her restructure her memories and distinguish between what Evelyn had made her believe and what belonged to reality. In the early sessions, Hannah often spoke of Evelyn not with hatred, but with a sense of emptiness. "I know she was wrong, but I can't hate the only person who ever sang me to sleep." The therapists encouraged her to write her story as a form of therapy, and from that, Hannah began keeping a journal, a habit Evelyn had once forced upon her that now became a tool for regaining balance. Alongside therapy, NCMEC worked with the Massachusetts Department of Social Services to help her reintegrate into society. Opening a bank account, obtaining legal identification under her real name, registering for insurance, and creating new medical records. They also helped her find a part-time job at the public library in Cambridge, a quiet environment where Hannah could gradually adjust to normal life. In the mornings, she walked to the library, shelved books, checked out materials, chatted briefly with colleagues, and returned to her small apartment in the afternoon. To those around her, she was simply a calm, reserved older woman who sometimes sat for hours reading old newspapers. Meanwhile, Eleanor maintained close contact. She visited her sister nearly every weekend, bringing family photos and recounting memories Hannah had never heard. The first birthday after the disappearance, a picture of young William, the sound of their mother reading prayers. At first, Hannah listened in silence, but gradually, she began asking questions and even laughed when she recognized small habits of her own, like tilting her head when thinking, that were identical to her father's. A bond formed between them that felt both new and deeply familiar, no longer just the relationship of a long-lost sister, but two pieces of the same story trying to fit back together. Every month, the two attended talks at NCMEC, where Hannah spoke to investigators and criminology students. She spoke slowly and clearly, without self-pity. "I can't get the time back, but I can use whatever I have left to remind people that missing children don't just exist in files. They are human beings, and sometimes they're still out there waiting to be called home." Her words were quoted in NCMEC's internal newsletter as a message of recovery. Legally, Hannah's true name was officially restored in October, after the Massachusetts State Court approved her identity verification documents. Her new birth certificate, clearly stating Hannah Louise Hughes, born 1951, Newburyport, Massachusetts, was presented to her in a small ceremony attended by Eleanor and the Cold Case Unit team. Holding the paper, she said softly, "I lived my whole life with a name that wasn't mine. Now I can finally sign my real one." By the end of the year, Hannah's physical health and mental state had stabilized. She joined an art class for seniors, made a few neighborhood friends, and began writing short memory fragments. In her journal she wrote, "Every morning I wake up, make coffee, and look out the window. Sometimes I still see the little girl in the red coat running across the yard, but this time she doesn't disappear." In Newburyport, the house on Merrimack Street now belonged to someone else, but every weekend, Hannah and Eleanor returned and stood in front of the newly built white fence. No words were needed. Both understood that although what was lost could never be recovered, Hannah's return was not just the end of a case. It was the beginning of a different life, one in which she was learning to exist within the truth, and where the Hughes family could finally call each other by name without relying on faded photographs. Even though she had settled into her new life and was gradually adjusting to her surroundings in Massachusetts, the psychologists in NMEC's recovery program noted that Hannah Hughes's mental condition still showed complex symptoms, particularly temporary cognitive disruptions and alternating memory gaps. During the extended therapy process, specialists observed that she often struggled to sequence life events chronologically, sometimes mixing real memories with those formed from the stories Evelyn had told her. When asked to recount her childhood, Hannah would frequently pause, frown, then smile apologetically. "I remember a doll, but I don't know if it was mine or someone else's." Such responses were described in the December 2015 psychological report as post-captivity memory disorder, temporal stream interruption type, a rare but recognized pattern in victims subjected to long-term cognitive control. She continued twice-weekly therapy sessions, alternating between individual and small group counseling. The treatment focused on rebuilding identity and strengthening reality orientation skills. Doctors used guided recall methods, asking her to write down events definitively verified by documents and then compare them with her subjective memories. Initial results showed Hannah could accurately identify only about 40% of her childhood memories. The rest were blurred or reconstructed from others' accounts. In group therapy, she often appeared confused when members mentioned parents or family. Once, when the therapist asked, "What do you remember about your birth mother?" Hannah was silent for a long time before answering, "I remember two women, one crying, one singing me to sleep. I don't know which one is real." Medical notes confirmed this as a typical reaction of dual memory syndrome, arising when the brain must reconcile two belief systems formed in different life phases. Beyond memory issues, Hannah struggled with social trust. Though polite and courteous, she kept people at a distance. Doctors attributed this to 6 decades of isolation and control by a single individual. She remained uncomfortable with unexpected touch on the shoulder or sudden footsteps behind her. In the first quarter 2016 periodic report, her primary psychiatrist wrote, "Patient shows significant improvement in self-identification, yet subconscious defensive reactions persist to sounds or gestures associated with control." To provide further support, NCMEC partnered with McLean Psychiatric Hospital in Belmont to implement a long-term treatment package, including cognitive behavioral therapy, memory therapy, and post-trauma emotional recovery programming. Hannah agreed to participate, viewing it as a necessary step toward understanding and accepting her past. She shared with her therapist that her dreams still returned to old images, the wooden house in Vermont, a knock at the door, and the woman calling Margaret. Even knowing they were dreams, she needed several minutes upon waking to remember where she was. Specialists identified this as delayed orientation, a common reaction in individuals with prolonged psychological control histories. To reduce flashback frequency, she was instructed to write down dreams and read them aloud in the next session to detach memory from emotion. This technique helped Hannah gain greater control over haunting mental images. By mid-2016, reports indicated her condition had stabilized. She no longer panicked at the sound of trains or the sight of snow, two triggers that previously provoked fear responses. Nevertheless, the treatment team emphasized the need for long-term therapy due to relapse risk. The comprehensive medical report, compiled by the McLean team and sent to NCMEC, stated clearly, Hannah Hughes, age 65, exhibits chronic post-traumatic stress syndrome with blurred memory factors. Continued therapy required for at least 24 months. Progress positive. Reality perception improved. Self-identification stable. NCMEC archived the report in the Recovered Missing Children Psychological Aftercare file as a model for future victim support programs. During the evaluation meeting, specialists concluded that Hannah represented a rare case demonstrating that recovery is possible even after decades of isolation, provided a robust medical and social support network exists. For Hannah herself, each passing day remained a process of relearning trust. Trust in her own memory, in the outside world, and in the name that had been returned to her. When asked if she ever wished to forget everything, Hannah simply smiled. No. I don't want to forget. I just want those memories to weigh less. In the year-end report, the treating physician wrote a brief note: patient is learning to live with the past instead of running from it. And perhaps that was what Hannah Hughes had been searching for over the past 60 years, not absolute peace, but the ability to endure memory without fear. In early 2017, as forensic specialists digitized the remaining physical evidence from the Hughes case for permanent storage in the national database, an unexpected detail emerged. Inside the box of materials seized from Evelyn Carter's home, sealed since 2015, a technician discovered a small envelope tucked between two old Polaroid photos. The envelope bore no label except faint handwriting, 1956. Private. When opened, it contained two blurry torso shots of Evelyn standing with a middle-aged man wearing glasses and a wool coat. They stood in front of a red brick building with a sign reading Randolph Clinic, Vermont. On the back of the photos, in pale blue ink, was handwritten, J. Keep your promise. The lab confirmed the images were taken on common commercial Kodak film from the mid-1950s, with no exact date, but matching the period shortly after Evelyn moved to Vermont. The presence of the unknown man prompted the cold case unit to re-examine all records, but nothing mentioned him in Evelyn's journals or prior statements. Myers, though retired, was brought back as a consultant and recommended sending the photos to the FBI for analysis. Upon enlargement, technicians noticed a small badge on the man's coat pocket, identical to those worn by social welfare agency staff, the same symbol used in the office where Joseph Randall worked. However, the face and build did not match Randall, who died in 1972. The Vermont Personnel Archives were asked to provide employee lists for 1955, 1957. Only one individual had a first initial J, John Havelock, a welfare officer and administrative inspector who worked alongside Randall. FBI records showed Havelock left his position in 1958 for unspecified internal violations, moved to Maine, and died in 1989. His personnel file was missing, but administrative stamps confirmed he had authority to certify civil documents, similar to Randall. The question arose, did Havelock assist Evelyn in legitimizing the identity, Margaret Lane? When investigators contacted Havelock's family, his son recalled seeing a photo of a curly-haired woman among his father's belongings, but did not know who she was. All attempts to establish a direct connection failed due to the age of the records and the deaths of everyone involved. Meanwhile, NCMEC received an anonymous letter mailed to its Boston office with a Burlington, Vermont postmark. It contained only the words, Evelyn didn't do it alone. He drove the car. No signature, no return address. The slanted handwriting, done in old-fashioned blue ink, was judged by experts to belong to an elderly person. Criminal analysts determined it did not match Randall or any known sample in the case file. However, the mention of car reminded investigators of the 1953 Buick excavated from Evelyn's backyard, its engine removed, and the frame buried. If a second man existed, he may have helped Evelyn relocate and dispose of the vehicle. A new hypothesis emerged. Havelock might have helped Evelyn ditch the car and provided necessary administrative paperwork, yet no physical evidence proved a direct link. Federal archives reviewed Havelock's old phone records, correspondence, and bank accounts, but found no unusual transactions. The FBI's preliminary report stated, the possibility of a second individual assisting suspect, Evelyn Carter, exists, but evidence is insufficient to initiate a formal investigation. The Massachusetts prosecutor's office agreed, noting that reopening the case when all suspected parties were deceased would yield no practical legal value. On March 5, 2017, the cold case unit issued an internal memorandum marking the matter closed, no further action. The two-page memo summarized, newly discovered photographs suggest the possible presence of a second individual, but lack legal basis and identifying evidence. No additional criminal elements established. When Eleanor read the news, she only sighed, maybe there will always be something we'll never fully know. Hannah, then in the final phase of treatment, responded more gently. If someone else was really involved, I think he just got caught up in her story too. The FBI report on the new discovery was filed as an appendix to Case 55-014 under the code Unresolved Detail. On the cover, in red ink, no reopening recommended. Everything ended there, leaving a shadow in the case history, not enough to alter the conclusion, but enough to suggest that behind the words resolved, there remained silent figures time had not yet named. After the internal memorandum closed the remaining questions, the Hannah Hughes case was officially transferred to reference status within the U.S. Department of Justice's National Training Program. In 2018, at the annual symposium on ancient DNA investigation and long-term cold cases held in Washington, D.C., the Hughes case was selected as the central case study, titled The Lost Child of Newburyport, a 60-year genetic resolution. The presentation detailed the entire investigative process, from recovering paper records to CODIS matching and civilian database utilization, becoming a model lesson for thousands of investigators nationwide. The Massachusetts Forensic Lab, in collaboration with the FBI and NCMEC, developed the training module Hughes Protocol, outlining standardized steps for handling historical evidence, preservation, digitization, and next-generation DNA comparison. The model was officially adopted in 2019, enabling numerous states to improve recovery of old samples. That same year, NCMEC launched a humanitarian initiative called the Hannah Fund, inspired by the Hughes story, to provide financial, legal, and psychological support to families of long-term missing children. The fund was established with initial public donations and a $1.2 million federal grant. Eleanor Hughes, as honorary co-founder, spoke at the Boston launch. My sister's name was chosen not to recall pain, but to represent the persistence of those who refuse to give up. The fund quickly became one of NCMEC's most effective partner organizations, supporting over 100 cold cases in its first 2 years. The center's 2020 internal report noted, Hughes Fund provided 38 DNA investigation grants for disappearances exceeding 40 years. Additionally, technical recommendations derived from the Hughes case prompted major changes in historical evidence storage procedures. Previously, most evidence from old cases was lost due to poor preservation conditions. After the Hughes case proved the value of a sweater retaining fiber structure for 60 years, the Federal Department of Justice issued new long-term storage guidelines requiring digitization and biological sensitivity classification. The Essex County Archives, once home to original File 55-014, were renovated into a state-of-the-art historical crime data center with temperature and humidity controls and barcode monitoring. At the opening ceremony, the state police director said, "Every file is more than paper. It may be the evidence that saves a life, even after half a century." The media called this the Hughes effect, how a case thought long asleep became the catalyst for systemic change. In academia, law and criminology schools began including the case in curricula. Northeastern University published the teaching material Case 55-014, Chain of Custody Over Time, simulating the entire storage and analysis process. Some sociologists viewed the Hughes case as an example of intergenerational justice, where one generation's actions can complete the unfinished work of another. At the national level, the U.S. Commission on Forensic Science recommended widespread adoption of the mixed investigative model, combining forensic and civilian genealogical data, the very model that brought Hannah Hughes home after 60 years. The Commission's 2021 report noted, the Hughes case demonstrated the integration of civilian DNA databases with federal forensic systems under ethical oversight. Meanwhile, the Hannah Fund continued to grow. Every February, on the anniversary of her disappearance, NEMEC holds a memorial event called Light for the Missing, lighting candles for unresolved cases. Though her health had declined, Hannah attended the first ceremonies, sitting quietly in the front row, watching photos of other missing children displayed around the hall. When asked for her thoughts, she told a reporter simply, "If I was found, then they can be too." That sentence appeared on NCMEC's homepage throughout 2022 as the organization's unofficial motto. That same year, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts passed the Hughes Amendment, adding a regulation that old physical evidence must not be destroyed even after the statute of limitations expires, because technology can redefine time. The Hannah Hughes case, once a dusty file, became a living legacy of modern investigation, opening a new era of justice unbound by years. And in Newburyport, in front of the old house on Merrimack Street, local residents placed a small plaque that reads simply, "Here once lived Hannah Hughes, lost and found, 1955-2015. In the spring of 2023, 8 years after the case was officially declared solved, Case 55-014 was formally transferred to the permanent archive of the Massachusetts Cold Case Unit. At a small ceremony held at the Boston headquarters, investigators, representatives from the NCMEC, and the State Department of Justice were present to witness the sealing of the original case file, 3 aged volumes from 1955, along with all modern reports and the remaining physical evidence preserved in a special metal box. On the lid of the box, a small plaque was engraved with the words, "Case 55-014, Hannah Louise Hughes. Missing 1955, found alive 2015, solved." Retired Lieutenant Daniel Myers, who had been specially invited back, gave a brief speech. "We are not just closing a file, we are preserving a reminder of the value of time." From that day forward, the Hannah Hughes case became part of the Cold Case Permanent Archive, a collection reserved for cases considered to have significant historical value and profound societal impact. At the same time, Hannah, now in her 70s, decided to make one final trip back to Newburyport. Eleanor accompanied her sister. They drove the old route from Salem, passing through the same small towns the family had traveled decades earlier. When the car stopped on Merrimack Street, the scenery had changed. New houses, taller trees, but the wind coming off the river and the salty smell of the ocean remained familiar. The old house had been painted gray-blue, with daffodils planted in the backyard. The current owners, a young couple who knew the story from the news, agreed to let them visit. Hannah walked slowly through the hallway, her hand lightly touching the doorframe where her mother once stood. She paused at the kitchen window. The afternoon sunlight streamed through and reflected in her clouded eyes. "Everything looks smaller," she said, her voice low but steady. Eleanor said nothing, only placed a hand on her sister's shoulder. They stepped into the backyard, where a red tricycle once stood. Now there was only smooth grass and a freshly painted white fence, yet for Hannah, all the old images seemed still present: falling snow, laughter, and a hand leading her away. As they left, she looked back at the house one last time and whispered, "I think I've come back to where it all began." Eleanor wrote those words in her personal journal. The final line read, "In the end, my sister is no longer a missing person." 1 week later, the NCMEC sent an official notice. The entire case file had been digitized and permanently stored in the national system with an eternal access code, and a copy had been forwarded to the Hannah Fund for educational purposes. In the thank you letter, the center's director wrote, "The Hughes case will forever stand as the gold standard for family perseverance and the power of forensic science." Yet, alongside the comfort, some details remained unresolved. Photographs of the man who appeared with Evelyn Carter, that were never fully explained, stayed in the case appendix, marked unresolved connection. The FBI reviewed them twice, but declined to reopen an investigation due to lack of new legal grounds. The final note in the archived report read, "Case 55-014, status, solved. Secondary inquiry, pending, indefinite. For the investigators, that was a familiar kind of closure, justice achieved, but mystery lingering. That fall, Hannah officially moved in with Eleanor in a small apartment near the Charles River. The two spent most of their time tending the garden and writing thank you letters to everyone who had helped during the reinvestigation. Hannah continued regular therapy, though her health was gradually declining. Still, every morning she made coffee, turned on the radio, and followed the news, as if to maintain a rhythm of connection with the world she had missed for 60 years. When asked what the closing of the case meant to her, she simply said, "The most precious thing is that I got to know the truth, and that someone was still waiting for me to come home." In November, the Cold Case Unit completed the final sealing report. On the cover of Case 55-014, next to the stamp "Solved, Deceased Suspect," the archivist added in blue ink, "Legacy, Human Resilience." Outside the building, the wind blew through the maple trees, and golden leaves covered the walkway. The story of Hannah Hughes ended there, a file closed, yet the questions, memories, and lessons about time quietly enduring, like a faint glow still lingering on the paper, among thousands of other cases that had faded into silence. The story of Hannah Hughes is not only the journey of a case solved after 60 years, it is also a mirror reflecting American society today, where technology, memory, and perseverance together redefine justice. In a vast country, with tens of thousands of unsolved missing persons cases, Hannah's reminds us that every piece of evidence, even something as small as a red sweater fragment, can become the key to truth if it is preserved and respected. Eleanor's refusal to let go, her decades-long monitoring of File 55-014, embodies the sense of personal responsibility that American society has always valued, that every citizen can contribute to the process of justice, not just through belief, but through concrete action. The success of DNA programs and the collaboration between NIMEC, the FBI, and ordinary citizens demonstrate the power of community and technology when directed toward a humanitarian goal. Yet the story also carries a warning, like Evelyn Carter: loneliness, mental disorder, and gaps in the welfare system can turn an ordinary person into a criminal. In today's United States, where mental health crises and social isolation are rising, the case reminds us that caring for mental health is the foundation for preventing tragedy. And from Hannah herself, we learn the lesson of recovery. Even after being stripped of her identity for 60 years, she still learned to live with her memories instead of running from them. In a society that prizes speed and results, this story reminds Americans today that both justice and healing require time, and that sometimes the right thing is not to seek forgetfulness, but to find a way to keep living with the truth. If you believe that every truth, no matter how long it has been buried, deserves to be found, please hit subscribe so we can continue this journey of uncovering cases that seemed forever lost to time. Thank you for joining us on Hannah Hughes's story. See you in the next video, where we'll keep searching for justice in the shadows of the past.